Good morning. Yeah, glad to see so many people here today. Yeah, right before the holiday, looking to get in a little bit of amazing education this morning. So my name is Dr. Kimberly Macquarie, and I am happy and proud to be the director of programming here at the Dalí Museum and the co-director of our innovation labs. And we are going to have an amazing program for you today with our Coffee with Curator lecture featuring Dr. Sarah Cartwright, who is the Chief Curator, and Ulla, our Searing Curator of Collections at the John and Mable Ringling Museum of Art. And she is going to be digging into the very interesting space that exists between what botanical images seem to do as documentation of the natural and how they actually function to represent nature and affect our perceptions of it. Now, of course, before we get to the lecture this morning, I'd like to give some thank yous, where thank yous are very, very due. And first, I'd like to thank the City of St. Petersburg. Of course, their continued sponsorship aids us in being able to present educational offerings like those we're going to enjoy today. And a warm thank you to all of our members, because without you, none of our programming is possible. And of course, I'd like to offer a special thanks to our exhibition supporters, the Keepers of the Collection annual fund donors, the Dalí Board of Trustees, the Guild at the Dalí, and our wonderful museum members, as well as this exhibition's hotel partner, Tradewind Island Resorts. Now, of course, if you want to find out more about the programming that we offer here, you can visit our website, thedalí.org, and you can find out about what activities that we have on offer. But I always like to give a little preview so I can create some FOMO for you. And sometimes it really is, because there's one on here that's absolutely sold out. So looking at the programs for July, this Friday, we're going to have our Dome Night, the Dalí Live 360. So if you have any people who are interested in seeing the Dome show, just the Dome show, you can always tell them that once a month we offer the opportunity for people to come in and just catch the Dalí Alive. On Sunday, if you have any little ones in your group, we have our Little Surrealist Tour. On Monday the 15th, our Evening of Fruits and Flowers Mixology. The July date is sold out, but there are tickets available for the October edition. And that's a really fun partnership with St. Petersburg Distillery, where we're going to practice infusing fruits and flowers into liquor. And we might sip a few cocktails, I don't know, let's see what happens. On the 18th, you are welcome to join us here on the first floor for free for our Surreal Nights at the Dalí. Every third Thursday, we have a DJ in here. We have some fun art activities, a signature drink, and we just happened this year, the 18th of July, didn't know if you know this, but it's National Tropical Fruit Day. So we are going to be enjoying not only a fruity cocktail, but we are also going to invite some local artists from the community who happen to also be gardeners and fruit enthusiasts for a tasting table of some interesting tropical fruits. So be sure to catch us then. If yoga is more your speed, be sure to be here on the 21st of July for our Yoga at the Dalí. And then on the 29th at 6 p.m., we have our very popular An Evening of Art and Food with Chef Chuck Bandel. There's still a few tickets available for the July date, and there are tickets available for the October date as well. So make sure that you join us for that. And please join us, of course, for next month's Coffee with the Curator lecture in August on the 7th, where we will be digging into the art and science of botanical illustration with Dr. David Barry from Selby Gardens. Now, today, it's my distinct pleasure to introduce our distinguished guest, Dr. Sarah Cartwright. At the Ringling, Dr. Cartwright oversees the curatorial department and is responsible for the museum's collection of European and American paintings, sculpture, and works on paper from antiquity to 1900. A specialist in Italian Renaissance art, with a particular focus on manuscript illumination, she's worked and published on a wide range of topics. Dr. Cartwright earned her PhD in art history and archaeology from the Institute of Fine Arts, New York University, and her MA in art history from New York University. Most recently, she curated the exhibition Shanique Smith Parade, which is on view at the Ringling through January 5th, 2025, and co-curated with Dr. David M. Stone the international loan exhibition Guercinos Friar with a Gold Earring, Fra Bonaventura, BC, painter and art dealer, and co-authored its catalog. Prior to joining the Ringling, she worked in a curatorial capacity at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and at Villa La Pietra in Florence, Italy, and taught art history in New York City as an Andrew W. Mellon postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University, and in Sarasota as a visiting professor at the Ringling College of Art and Design. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Dr. Sarah Cartwright.
Impressive. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to see you all here. I, too, am quite amazed on July 3rd, day before a national holiday. Everyone has turned out so beautifully, so thank you. And thank you to Kim, Dr. Makware, who has invited me today to speak in front of you. I'm really thrilled to be here, and I thank all the staff here at the museum who make this program possible, this whole series. And I will give a plug also for David Barry's talk next month, because he's a good friend of mine and he's here today, and I want to embarrass him. So I changed the title slightly on my slide from what was in the program, because I kind of I had it as documentation and artistic license before in Western flower imagery. And really what I was getting at was more naturalism and abstraction. Both titles work, but as I was working through this material, I felt like this was a more appropriate title. And the occasion, of course, for this talk today is the beautiful exhibition on view right now, Reimagining Nature, Dalí's Floral Fantasies, which I had an opportunity to visit thanks to Kim. Actually, my daughter and I had an opportunity to visit and discover in May. This show was curated, of course, by Peter Tusch here at the Dalí, and it's really wonderful show full of amazing material, and I have really enjoyed using this as a basis for this talk and thinking about Dalí in a new way. And let's see, so today I'm just going to present some of the threads that I teased out of this material, things that this show stimulated for me. And there's a lot more, but we only have about an hour, so I hope you enjoy this little detour today, away with Dalí, but also away from Dalí, and then back to Dalí. So I'm starting out with Dalí. He's the reason we're here, all right? And today I'm most interested in the first two print series that are on view in this exhibition, not so much the third one because I didn't really have a chance to tie into it as much. But this image that you see on the screen is the Dahlia unicornis from the first series, the Flora Dalinae, on view, and that's from 1968. And as the exhibition and its catalog, which is beautiful, by the way, the catalog is definitely something to acquire. As the exhibition and its catalog note, this image by Dalí is an elaboration, a reworking of an original work by the Belgian painter and botanist Pierre-Joseph Redoutey. Redoutey is the leading botanical painter of his day. By his day, I mean the late 18th, early 19th centuries in France. Although Redoutey himself was Belgian, he was not French. He was a foreigner in France. And he was one of the most famous botanical illustrators of all time. So just to talk a little bit about Redoutey, because I think it's worthwhile, and there's more comparison coming, but just to give you some background. So Redoutey was the royal designer and painter for three successive French empresses, Marie Antoinette, Josephine Bonaparte, and Marie Amélie. He was nicknamed the Raphael of Flowers. It's a pretty good name to be compared to Raphael, the painter, the Italian painter. And three of his major publications, and by publications I mean print series, print publications that were produced from his original paintings. So three of his major publications, the one about lilies, les liliacées, the one about roses, les roses, and the one we're looking at here, an image from here, the Choix des plus belles fleurs, were produced under royal patronage. And they depict plants from the French imperial gardens. So that's important. This is work that was produced at a really, really high level with money that only royalty can provide, really. So if you think about printing in this time, France, of course, had some of the most advanced printers, the most advanced engravers, the most advanced paper. They were really the sine qua non. They were really the highest level of print productions. And that's part of the reason for Redutay's reputation. Of course, his images are beautiful, but these productions were extremely luxurious and could only have been afforded by a small percentage of the population, right? So Redutay's original images, he's a painter and also a botanist. His original images were painted in watercolor on vellum. And there are some of those preserved, and sometimes they come up on the art market and they command very, very high prices because there are so few left that sort of circulate. But as I mentioned, these watercolor paintings he created were then turned into prints. And that's the case for the image you're seeing here. This is a print, a stipple engraving, that is a translation, a copy of his original watercolor into the medium of engraving. And these were printed with color on the plates. So the print was pulled with color, and then they were finished by hand with additional color, sometimes in a variety of techniques. So again, each one bears distinct differences, right? They are each one is sort of a singular artwork in itself, even though they are prints. The prints were, as I mentioned, very, very well received. They were praised for the soft modulation of form and the delicate coloring, which again was achieved through this very time-consuming print technique and then hand finishing technique. This image comes from one of his last publications, the Choix des plus belles fleurs, which is selection of the most beautiful flowers. And this was produced from 1827 to 1833. And I have the full title in French here, and it is important to consider the full title. The translation is a selection of the most beautiful flowers, note flowers, taken from different families of the plant kingdom, and a few branches of the most beautiful fruits, sometimes grouped together, and often animated by insects and butterflies. One of these beautiful 19th century titles that it's just a shame we don't call books the way they used to. Redutay dedicated this publication, the Choix des plus belles fleurs, to the young princesses Louise and Marie d'Orléans. They were the daughters of Louis Philippe, who would become the king of France, the citizen king, in 1830. So, let's keep going here. These are some more images from this publication, from the Choix des plus belles fleurs, and I'm going to show you a few more as well. So normally, I don't stand at the podium, by the way. So if you see me looking a little funky, it's because I actually like to walk and ask you questions and make you raise your hands and make you answer me. But that's not really the format here today. So I'm going to have to do it all myself, sadly. So we're quickly struck, I think, most of us, by the beauty of these images. And most people agree. These are exceptionally beautiful things. And let's not forget, you're looking at an image on a screen. This is a digital image, probably of another digital image, filtered, through PowerPoint, et cetera, et cetera. So they look a lot better in person, trust me. We actually do have some works by Redutay in the Ringling's collection. And I wish I could have brought an original Redutay with me today, but, registrars don't like it when you just take things out of storage and bring them. I probably could have gotten permission, but I was stressed out enough just getting here in morning traffic than to have a priceless artwork in my car. So these kinds of images, we know them pretty well, I think, most of us. We've probably seen something like this at some point in our lives, maybe a poster, maybe you're a fan of gardening and you have many books about flowers, about gardens, but even children are exposed to these kinds of images sometimes in picture books. And they are a part of our education, of our culture, of the sort of encyclopedic knowledge that we're used to, right? We're used to the concept of an encyclopedia. And of course, that comes out of the same period, comes out of the Enlightenment, the 18th and early 19th century. And I'm going to ask you for a moment to look beyond them as beautiful things, to look beyond their beauty, to kind of allow your brain to analyze what's before your eyes. And that's what I'm going to ask you to do. So if I were asking you questions, I would ask, what do we notice right away if we are ignoring the beauty? What do we notice about these as images presented to our eyes? So I would say they are isolated images of plants. And by isolated, I mean there is no background. They are against a blank background, empty background. Is it the whole plant? No, I see you shaking your heads. Indeed, it is not. And this was alluded to in the title, which is why I wanted to read it to you. Redoute says it's a selection of flowers and branches. And so that's exactly what they are. They are not an entire plant. They are a piece of an entire plant. I'm just going to show you a couple more. They are extractions. They are severed pieces. The flowers are cut, and they're cut really short, if I might add. I used to do this in my grandmother's garden when I was tiny. I would bring her flowers that I cut that had no stems. She got really upset with me. She couldn't do much with them except put them in a dish of water. But this is kind of the same thing, and you can even see, does the clicker have a laser? I bet it does. You can even see, in some cases, the cutting, the angle at which it's cut, and the detail of what the stem and the leaf look like when they're severed is given there. That cutting at an angle, which is what, of course, gardeners and horticulturalists do when they cut pieces, that's emphasized, it's shown here. So they have this cut-off quality combined with the empty background. They are divorced from context, I would say. And what context is that? What context are they divorced from? The garden, and reality, the context of nature, right? Nature around us, the nature that we know. And by nature, I mean not just plants, not just flora and fauna. I mean the natural world, our world. If we look again, we can see the light is flattened out on these. It's more evident in some than in others. But there is not very much contrast of light and shade. It's much reduced, that contrast. It makes everything kind of look the same. There's this kind of impossibly flat light, which is really weird if we think about when these images were created in a period before artificial light, right? So there's sunlight and there's candlelight or oil light. There's not the kind of flat light we are used to in our lives. The space is hard to read. What space is there? Is there space? There's very little reference, right? We have overlapping of flowers, of leaves, and that's one way we know there's space. We know there's recession in space. And then there's color. Color is used to sometimes differentiate that space. Something overlaps. It's sometimes lighter in color. It's actually not very emphasized in this slide. Here, a little bit, you can see, particularly in the fig, there's a lighter color used for those leaves which are further back, right? And sometimes there's foreshortening. For example, when the leaves curl, right here, right? That's an example of foreshortening. We're seeing that leaf is curling. We're getting that sense of it receding into space. But generally, the outline of the flower and the leaf and the bud, and in this case, some of the insect, some of the butterflies, the outlines are emphasized of these flowers. And the cleft in the fruit, for example, with the fig, these are things to clue you into something, right? These are considered important details for some reason. And what reason is that? It's really to let you know the characteristic shape of these flowers, right? He's trying to present you with the most characteristic side, the most characteristic shape. And what don't we see? What else don't we see? We don't see any evidence of what? Skill. Scale. That's true. There's not an evidence of scale, right? Because we have no point of reference. We have nothing else to compare it to. We don't see something that's very natural, and that is decay. There's no evidence of decay here. There are no brown leaves. There are no withered flowers. There are no dry buds. There are no rotten fruit. Very natural, wouldn't you say? These images are like some kind of Platonic ideal of this flower, right? That's what I'm getting from. They're divorced from reality. And when someone said scale, I thought you said skill. We don't see skill either. We don't see any brushstrokes. We don't see any evidence of the artist's hand. We don't see, it's kind of like as I said, they're sort of existing apart from any natural human-made or nature-made component. We don't see any emotion. We don't see any drama that I can find. I mean, if you find these dramatic, please tell me. And so what I'm getting at here is that this is kind of a fantasy world. And I like using that phrase because that reminds me a little bit of someone closer by here who's known for depicting rather fantastic fantasy worlds, and that's Dalí. And I would argue that this is no less fantastic, no less of a fantasy than Dalí's. This fantasy world that we're in here is a world of conventions. And I mean by that, the function of these images is in part to provide a clear illustration of an object, in this case, fruit or flowers. And there are conventions, there are accepted ways of doing that the artist has adopted. And some of those things we just talked about, the outline being very clear so that you can identify the plant, it being on an empty background with nothing else around, to make it clear what is being depicted, to be able to identify it. Another convention, of course, is the label, the caption, right? That's part of this long tradition of botanical illustration. But again, that's kind of weird. There's an empty background with overlapping space, so there's some space there, and then there's a text that interrupts that fantasy. So these are like composites, let's say, right? They're composites with key elements needed for transmitting identification. It's not a depiction in a way that the artist actually saw. It's impossible to say that. I think it's impossible to say that Redoute only painted a narcissus that was absolutely perfect in every way and did not have one brown spot anywhere or one dried leaf anywhere. He didn't. He saw real things and he painted something else. So there's a reason for that. So these images by Redoute are not even sort of the traditional botanicals. These were intended for a very wide audience, as wide an audience as possible, and produced at this high level. So I just want to show you, I know, long quote, no one likes a long quote, but this one's interesting. This is from Redoute's introduction, his preface to this book. And he talks about how the art of painting plants, which is what he's doing, has no less utility than charm. So it's not just charm, it's not just pretty, it also has utility, it has usefulness. And then he gets into how these images can present, obviously they're pleasing paintings to admirers of nature. For women, they present pretty images that women can be compared to. That's lovely, early 19th century. But to manufacturing, these are models, charming and precious models for products to be made that are enriched by the natural world, by the borrowings of the natural world. So that gives you a clue that he's looking beyond just admiring nature, and he's talking about how these images could be adopted and appropriated in the industrial arts, right, in all kinds of applications. And then he talks about the way he's achieved the height he has is through this triple union of accuracy, composition, and coloring, the union of which alone can bring plant iconography to perfection. And so then he dedicates this book to all these sort of areas he's already talked about: disciples of botany, followers of industry, friends of the arts. And then I just want to point out that he gives a shout out to his illustrious predecessor, Van Spandonk, who was also a foreigner, a Dutchman. And remember, Belgium and what we now call the Netherlands were part of the same area for a long time. So although languages are different and religions are different, he probably considered Van Spandonk a closer countryman than the French. And Van Spandonk is actually also really amazing and different, very different from Redoute, right? So Van Spandonk worked in watercolor, which is what you see at upper left, oil on upper right, and then these are two prints produced from Van Spandonk's watercolors. Very different. I don't have time to talk about him, but I wish I did. To me, there's a ton of drama. To me, there's a ton of, there's more crinkle, there's more decay, there's more time, there's more excitement, there's more confrontation with reality. But that's not what Redoute is doing. Okay, so, sorry, let me find my page here. Oh, right. Sorry. Just one last thing about Redoute. This idea of composition and color and exactitude he's talking about. The composition part, I think what what I would take that to mean is not just a pleasing composition, but the fact in composing the image, what he has filtered out. And we've talked about those things he's filtered out. And you could say that by filtering out those things, decay, space, light, he has sacrificed naturalism, that it's actually less naturalistic, less a representation of the natural world. It actually works against naturalism. That's my contention. That's where I stand. So, Dalí and redoute. I think, and again, this is just me, I think that Dalí perceived this somehow in some of these botanical illustrations. I don't know if he perceived it consciously or subconsciously, but he perceived those artistic choices that redoute made. And I say that because there's this resultant, what I would call almost artificiality of the redoute image. And Dalí is an artist, coming from his perspective of surrealism, would not have been one to take at face value this idea that redoute's illustrations are more accurate representations of nature, right? Because, that's just not how Dalí operates, right? He's in a different period, a different time, questioning much of what has come before. And Dalí seems to pick up on this empty, dissected, dismembered, almost disembodied quality of these botanical illustrations. And that instability and artificiality that they have. And what does he do? He steps in to fill the lack, right? He perceives that lack and doesn't like it, or feels that he should fill it. So he takes that whole composition that redoute was so proud of and changes it entirely. So just a brief note here on what book did Dalí use. And I don't have time to get into this, and nobody really knows in the case of these illustrations, because we don't have Dalí's original watercolors for this series that we know of. I don't think they've been found. So at the top, these are images scanned from the Bibliothèque Nationale de France of the original first edition of redoute. On the lower left and lower right are later editions, 1939 and 1955. And my guess is that Dalí was probably using a 1955 edition as a model. And I say that because you can see how the color gets really bleached out into these wider zones here. There's not this sort of soft gradation of coloring as you see in the original or even in this 39 edition. It's much more stark contrasts between light and dark. And that's closer to what we see in the image Dalí produces, right? It's kind of taken that to a different degree. But again, we're looking at images of prints. It's very hard to know when you're talking about what we're seeing on PowerPoint. Much better to have the originals in your hand, but again, not easy. So this is just a reminder of the difference between these two images, and then we're going to go into what Dalí does a little bit more specifically here. So what is Dalí adding? To me, the most fundamental thing he adds is this earthly setting in the remark, and that's the etched design on the bottom. He insistently adds a horizon line, a ground line, a grounding, marking this, attaching this back to earth. It's constantly putting back into the earth. The cut stem ends up, in this case, turning into the body of a horse and then touching the ground. He adds landscape. He wants to anchor this in reality in the earth. He creates a sense of a vast setting, and some of them are more than this one, but I'm just focusing on this one for now to keep us in the same image. This vast sense of scale of the background and these familiar huge contrasts of scale that we know Dalí is fond of doing in his art. So now what's happened? We have these smaller figures here. Well, we could say they're smaller figures, but maybe they're regular size figures, and this thing is a gargantuan sculpture, a gargantuan deity, a gargantuan construction. Now, right? If this is our recognizable earth, now this thing has become huge. It's a giant, maybe an idol that is worshipped with these figures underneath. He populates the image. He's putting human figures in and animal figures in. He's supplying that natural element that is lacking. And he makes it, by doing that, into, and this is key, a figural narrative. right? So now Dalí is telling a story, a different story, through the addition of these figures. And this is the Western tradition that Dalí is grounded in, the figural narrative tradition, where human bodies, or sometimes animals, are interacting with one another in such a way as to tell a story. And that's the high point of European painting for centuries before Dalí. And then, of course, he's also changing the flower image itself. Of course, it's become a unicorn with 3 heads, 3 slightly different heads, and 3 horns. So he modifies the original flower, but then he also adds these things below. This, in a way, to me, this addition of a figural narrative, this moves it away from abstraction and more toward the figurative, more toward representational art. We could see Redouté's work as the more abstract of the two, is what I'm getting at. And Dalí's approach is actually more conservative and more based in the Western tradition. You also see the artist's hand. You can see this where he starts painting lines, extra lines on the leaf. He shows you his hand, the sketchiness of the remark, the sketchiness of the etched figures below. They're not carefully done. They're done, I mean, they may be carefully done, but they're intended to look as though they were done quickly, right? With scratching images. They have the freshness of a sketch. That's the whole point of them. That's the artist's hand reappearing where it wasn't visible in Redouté. He changes colors. He changes the shading on the leaf. He's changing up the shading. And all of these things contribute to it having a completely different function and a completely different sort of artistic heritage, if you were. He completely reworks the artistic heritage of this image. I want to move on to talk about some of the other images that were the basis for illustrations in this first series by Dalí. And Peter Tush, in his talk last month, which I didn't get to see in person, but I did get to see the recording, talked a little bit about the discovery of the basis for some of these images by Dalí, which were not known previously. This series of images is also a royal-sponsored set of images, but slightly different. This is a royal expedition to the New Kingdom of Granada, which was Colombia in South America in the late 18th, early 19th century. That was a very long expedition that endeavored to document plants and flowers from that area, and they ended up producing 7,000 images. This was a project led by José Celestino Mutis, who was a clergyman and a botanist, and he lobbied for this with the Spanish crown and eventually was granted permission to lead this expedition. Imagine going to lead such a thing at this in the late 18th century where people really hadn't, Western Europeans hadn't really been that much, and documenting all this. He puts together a team of illustrators, many of whom are born in South America. They're criollos. They are probably mostly people who were of Spanish descent who had been born in South America. And their name, they don't sign all their images, but their names are known. And there has been an effort in Spain, all of these are now housed at the Real Jardín Botánico in Madrid, to figure out which illustrator did what, and that's still ongoing. These were not known publicly until the 1950s because when the expedition ended, everything was sent to Spain. It went to Spain, but the descriptions and the textual component that was supposed to have gone with this book was lost, and so it was never published. So it was kind of hidden. But then in the 1950s, they start to share these images, and that's, I imagine, when Dalí became aware of them. But they're incredible. They're fascinating. They're quite different from Redouté. They have a very, very rich color component. And here is one of the images that was the basis for, this is one of Dalí's images in the first series. And they tend to have, in contrast to Redouté, they are abstract. They're more abstract, not in contrast to Redouté. Like Redouté, they are abstractions, but they do it in a very different way. They're much more interested in symmetrical patterning, flattening, as I said, much sort of deeper resolution of color. Let me see, I think I have another couple here. Covering the whole space more, the whole field, the whole page, the whole piece of paper. What else do we have? And some of this interest in symmetry may have been influenced by local artistic traditions, right, in South America, which would not be surprising. This hasn't been terribly well studied, but it's getting more studied. And here's another one. And you can see what Dalí does with that. So they represent another type of botanical illustration that is in line with reduté, but also goes in a different direction. And I would love to spend more time on these, but I wanted to make you aware of them because they're so beautiful. And you can look at these on the website of the Royal Botanic Garden in Madrid. It's a little bit hard to search, but they are there. And you can also see as we go through here, sorry, I forgot to mention, Dalí's addition of the ground, the horizon line, the scale, the shadow, right? He's creating shadow in those remarks. So just to remind ourselves, this is perfectly in keeping with what we see Dalí doing in his paintings. I think, and I'm probably not the first person to say this, I'm not a scholar of Dalí, so forgive me because I don't know the literature on him as well as other things. To me, he's fundamentally a landscape painter. He is tied to the landscape, to the horizon in a way that was surprising even to me as I started looking through images. And I have chosen some here from the museum's collection, the Dalí Museum's collection. Almost all of these have a horizon line, and this is not really, it wasn't hard to find these. It wasn't like I had to dig. And the same sense of scale, right? So we could compare the Prince series with the huge flower and the tiny figures. We could compare it to this, right? And interestingly, this is also an important work from the European canon, right? That Dalí has transformed. But that's where these figures are reminiscence of Millet's Angelus. So it's interesting that he's kind of doing the same thing with a flower in the reduté engraving. And these are, as I said, I'm just kind of showing you these so you can see what I'm talking about, Dalí's landscapes. And again, even when he moves toward more sort of what you might call more unusual, won't call it abstract, because this is still very, very representational, but even more mixed up things, he's still interested in the horizon. He's still interested in the landscape and in the human recognizable element of the space. So Dalí's paintings are based on nature. He really doesn't abandon nature. And I don't think I really thought about that in the same way before looking at this talk. He doesn't reject nature. He embraces nature. And what he does, even though surrealism has a lot of weird stuff in it, let's be honest, it's still recognizable. It's still natural. So now for a minute, I want to talk about the tradition of reduté, of botanical illustration, and this idea of plants being depicted by themselves on a page in a rather disembodied way, right? This has a really, really long history going back to antiquity. On the left, upper left, you see that's a 6th century manuscript of the Dioscorides manuscript. It certainly records a much, much older manuscript tradition, even probably pre-manuscript, where we're talking about rolls, that this notion for medicinal purposes, for the study of botany, that these plants were depicted on a page by themselves. So in a way, these are like the predecessors for reduté, right? They're kind of flattened. The outline is what's important. The basic information is what's important. And in the Vienna Dioscorides at the upper left, it's quite naturalistically represented. What happens as we move through the early Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, these manuscripts keep getting copied. They are important because they go back to antiquity. They contain ancient wisdom, ancient knowledge about plants and how plants can be used for medicinal purposes and other purposes. And so these manuscripts become, they just get copied, and the method of sort of depicting the plant remains somewhat constant, but they turn into real abstractions, right? Would you know what plant this is? If you do, I'm impressed. Like you can open a book and see that and be like, yeah, I know what that is. They look far from reality, and that's because they're based on these ancient exempla. They're based on something that's getting copied over and over again. And by the time we get to, so this is a 12th century 11th century, late 11th century manuscript from Oxford. This one's actually a little less abstracted in some ways, but still these images, we know them because they're based on a very long manuscript tradition, and these artists are kind of just changing them slightly. This one, on the other hand, again, this is the same Pseudo-Apuleius, which is a 4th century text that, again, probably depends on earlier knowledge. This one's super abstracted. This becomes something else entirely. But what you have in these images, of course, is text that kind of takes up the space and explains what's going on and gives you context that you don't really have in Redoute. In Redoute's images, you have a little caption, but you don't have a reason to have all that blank background. There's no text in Redoute. Here there is. Here there's, something filling that up. Let's see, what do we have next? On the other hand, you also had in antiquity a tradition of naturalistic representation, right, of the natural world, a very sort of, and so I'm getting back at these opposite poles of abstraction and naturalism, right? So we've just seen the kind of abstraction that happens in the manuscript, herbal manuscript tradition. Going back to antiquity, this is 1st century BC frescoes from the Villa of Livia. That's not Pompeii. That's totally wrong. These are. I was using a Pompeian example. These are from the Villa of Livia outside Rome. So ignore that, please. I changed my slides. But these are, as you can see, very subtly observed images of the natural world, of a garden. Are they necessarily taken totally from life? No. We know, because there's a whole lot of images in this room that survive, multiple flowers are depicted together at times when these flowers cannot have been together. These plants bloom at different times, right? So it is an amalgam, it is a composite. It's not a snapshot of what a garden looked like at any one moment in time. However, it is rendered with a sort of beauty and sensitivity to light and shade, space, relationships of color that represents a bit of the opposite end of the spectrum from those manuscripts we just saw. And as we move through time, and I'm skipping a lot of things. I could not give you a whole history of this if I wanted to. We would be here for days. It sounds like fun, but this is an interesting herbal from about 1400 in the collection of the University of Pennsylvania, which came from the Lawrence Schoenberg collection. He lived in Sarasota for a long time, and then donated his manuscripts to Penn. But this one has multiple styles of drawing within the same manuscript, and the ones on the right, on the rectos of the page, are based on an earlier tradition, like the tradition we just saw in those previous manuscripts. They're somewhat formulaic and abstracted, but then the artist, whoever put this manuscript together, also added new images which appear to have been done from life. So there's an interest here, and the same page layout, we have kind of the two different methods. This one that's kind of the abstracted, and the one that's more observed from life. And I think that's really interesting. This is a fascinating manuscript. And these are all online as well with Penn. You can scroll through every page of every manuscript just about in that collection, which is a wonderful thing. Technology has changed our lives. Certainly changed the life of scholars, I can tell you. Studying manuscripts was no fun before the digital world. Microfilm. Does anyone remember microfilm? Yeah, that was my life. So that was an early 15th century manuscript, around 1400, right? And as we move into the 15th century, again, this is an oversimplification. I can't give you every detail and every twist and turn, but we start to see a rise of interest in painters in representing the natural world. And this seems to have started in the north of Europe, so in the Netherlands and Germany. And we see this in paintings. Jan van Eyck, you all probably know the name Jan van Eyck. If you don't, you should, because he's pretty awesome. But this representation of lilies here, which is so carefully painted with the shade, light and shade, and the space. You really sense the space around each of those lily flowers, right? You get a sense of how this plant exists in nature, even though it's cut and put here for this. Actually, I thought it was in a vase, but actually it looks almost as though it's growing out of the ground, doesn't it? And then in manuscript tradition as well. So this is a very common kind of border in these Flemish northern manuscripts where you have flowers and there's shade under each flower. I hope you can see that. The flower kind of seems to hover on the surface as it's shaded underneath, and then the vignettes. So we see this happening, and it starts to influence painters all over Europe. And one of the great practitioners we think of in this regard is Albrecht Dürer, of course, who was known for his nature studies, but he also painted paintings that were somewhat abstracted. I mean, to me, the face of himself, he painted himself here as a self-portrait. This is a kind of an abstraction of a human figure. It doesn't look terribly naturalistic to me, but his plants and animals are extremely naturalistic. And so this is just part of this interest, particularly in the north, of observing from life. And it was said for the hare, the young hare, which is another one of his famous drawings, that he used dead animals to study. And of course that's happening in Italy as well. Leonardo da Vinci is working at the same time, doing similar things to understand nature better by dissecting and all those things. And then as we move into the 16th century, we see the return in a new form of the herbal, right? And so these are printed versions of those manuscripts with herbals we saw before, and these represent new research, new methods of illustrating. This is woodcut, and these are colored woodcuts, but also very much kind of in the old tradition. The plant is on its own, the plant is outlined, the plant is very clearly depicted so that you can understand it, right? And so that tradition just keeps persisting in these kind of scientific manuscripts. But there is a unicorn, and that's very scientific. And so these and what happens is that these images just start getting filtered around and used in different books. The images from Fuchs, they start circulating in other, people pick them up and use them in other books. And then we get somebody like Arcimboldo on the other side, right? Or is he the other side? Is he the sort of abstracted, isolated flowers from nature, or is he more the painterly, figural, narrative, naturalistic side? He's kind of both. He kind of straddles both. I mean, some of these flowers in this necklace look as though they could have been included in a botanical print, don't they? They almost look like that, but yet they're included in an amalgam altogether, which creates a figural narrative. So this one kind of, an artist like Arcimboldo kind of straddles both sides of this equation. And then, how am I doing on time? I'm all right. And then we have the still life tradition, right? With an artist like Caravaggio. This is one of the most famous still lifes of all time in the Ambrosiana in Milan, where it is this, on the wall with this incredible light that makes it shine like as though it's lit from within. And unfortunately, you don't get that at all in a slide. And Sanchez Cotan, Spanish still life artist. So about these, are they more like a botanical illustration, or are they more like a naturalistic view of what's really there? Botanical, someone said. Yeah, it's they kind of go more that way. The Sanchez Cotan with these individual vegetables and fruit kind of placed in such deliberate fashion, but each one highlighted, each one meaningful. It does remind us of what we see in a work of botany, but they're arranged in such a way that they create a different meaning here in this context, with the lighting, with the stone ledge. So, and the same with Caravaggio. This basket seems almost to have been represented from life, and yet it's cut out in such a way it doesn't really relate to the background very well, and it has these stark contrasts between the space and no space. Right? There's recession in space of these fruits and grapes and leaves, but is there? Because sometimes right behind those leaves, it just looks like, boom, there's nothing else. But there has to be something else because it's a basket. It's round, right? It has to extend into space. but he's almost cutting off that possibility. And then you have artists, just because I love these artists and I'm kind of obsessed, and they're not as well known as others, so you're going to learn about them today if you don't know them. Jacopo Ligozzi, who's working for the Medici court in the late 16th century, and Ligozzi is an artist who does everything, literally paints in almost every technique, produces large-scale, small-scale paintings, documentation of the natural world, everything you can imagine. But even here, he's producing two different styles of work. So this wonderful marmot with a branch of plums, and the plums almost look like botanical illustration, right? But here we have this animal who has so much life and personality in a setting that we recognize. And then down here at the right, these are more traditional botanicals that Ligozzi produced at the request of the Medici court. And yet they have so much, they have personality. And this is what's always said about Ligozzi, that he somehow captured the spirit, not only of animals, but of plants. How do you capture the spirit of a plant? It's amazing, but he does. And here we have brown leaves. We have crunchy things. We have crunchy, dirty things. We have insect damage. We have a real plant. And then Giovanna Garzoni, who is a wonderful and still undersung, although getting more well-known, woman artist who also worked at the Medici court in Florence, but for other important courts. And she was producing miniatures like this, which is watercolor on vellum, these kinds of scenes which involved fruit and insects and birds and flowers, but of course also these remarkable botanicals. These are in the Uffizi collection. And these almost remind me of Dalí, because here she's depicting this amazing flower, cut one in this case. Here we have the roots, but then she does similar to what Dalí did, right? She creates this setting, these smaller things underneath, the fly, or actually it's not a fly, it's a hymenopteron, and almonds and fruit, and they're shaded. Right, there's this shade that they throw on the ground, just like Dalí's small figures in the, not just like, but to me, recalling Dalí's small figures in the remark of his prints. And then just in case you feel moved to buy some still lifes, the auction houses can oblige you. As I was going through the work for this talk, I was also looking at auction catalogs because their sales were yesterday and today. But these two stood out to me because, again, I wanted to represent the Dutch and Flemish tradition, and this is 17th century, but I also thought it was interesting, the contrast. So here we have Ozias Beert, Flemish artist, and here we have Balthasar van der Ast, Dutch artist. Where would we classify them? To me, Beert this is all about patterning. There's very little space, there's very little depth. There's there's an abstract quality to Beert's work, in my opinion. And then van der Ast is more about a setting, more about spatial relationships, and telling this story through what turns out to be a figural narrative involving a bird and fruit and shells. And this is a work from the Ringling's collection, which I'm just throwing in because I also find this question really interesting. When you have two styles within one painting. So this is a painting by Rubens, Peter Paul Rubens, and Ozias Beert, who you just saw. So Beert is a famous flower painter. This painting needed flowers, and this was not uncommon. Maybe a little less common in the north than in the south. But so Rubens paints the figures, and Beert paints the flowers. And this is the image from our website, and this is a photo I took. And my phone takes slightly different blues. I've noticed the blue is weird on my phone. But I hope you can see the approach to flowers. There's a delicate sort of belabored sense of the flowers here. That's Beert's style versus Rubens' broad brushstrokes, much more loose handling. And the light on these flowers is kind of separate from the lighting of the figures. right? And that makes this sort of eerie quality where they don't quite match. If you really start to look at this, you notice it quite well. Is he an amazing painter of flowers? Yes. But they kind of work against the naturalism of the rest of the painting. They work against the illusionism of this scene when you have this difference of lighting. And here I'm just throwing in, this is a detail from a different painting by Rubens and Workshop in our collection, just to give you a sense of what Rubens' fruit looks like. It's much more muscly, it's much more broad strokes, it's much more interested in kind of these effects of, larger effects of light. These almost are like figures. Whereas Bayard is getting into the weeds with, literally, with the lighting. And then just one more example of that, and this is, I just saw this in New York the other day at a dealer, but it also struck me as similar to the Bayard and Rubens, where you have these two modes operating. So this is the work of Luca Giordano, the figures, and then the still life portion is by Giovanni Battista Ruopolo, who was a very well-known still life painter. And again, there's a change in lighting. There's a difference in handling. And by handling, I mean brushstrokes, the way the artist handles paint. There's a disconnect here. Clearly, probably didn't bother people at the time, but and part of that disconnect is this different approach that we've been talking about. That doesn't explain it all. But this idea of kind of being focused on the fruit, individual fruit, its shape, its form, presenting it in the clearest possible way, right? And then the more naturalistic tradition of kind of figural narrative. And I just want to show you images from another important botanical publication, which is a little bit earlier than Redouté's. And this is the Temple of Flora, produced by Robert John Thornton. And this is a huge project that Thornton came up with himself. And unlike Redouté, Thornton had no royal patronage. He wanted to produce this enormous 3-volume work. And the third part would be the Temple of Flora, which would have these huge plates, huge prints of flowers. And he did produce some of them. But this project basically bankrupted him because he did not have outside funding. And it came in fits and starts. It wasn't entirely completed. But some of these images were. And, these are very famous images today and collected by museums and collectors. The one on the left, the superb lily, these are both from Boston's collections, but we do have a version of this in the Ringling collection, which was very generously donated to us. But what do we see here? Here we kind of have both. We have the plant very carefully represented, but we also have a setting. We have a setting in which the plant seems to tell a story on its own, right? So it could be done within the botanical tradition to have the setting, to have the space, to have a story. But that's not what Redouté does. I think these are amazing. And then at the very end, just in the last few minutes, I wanted to talk about the second series a little bit, because this also factors into Dalí's kind of approach, painterly approach. So for this series, the fruits, les fruits, this one from the next year, 1969, for this series, Dalí's original watercolors do survive. And Peter talked about this in his talk last month. They were sold at auction in 2013. I don't know where they've ended up. Perhaps Peter knows. But the images of those watercolors are still online. And you can see, which we couldn't see in the first series because we don't have Dalí's original paintings that were then turned into the prints, of course. You can see what he does with his hand with the brush. So this is one of those original watercolors. And I just think it's worth looking at the delicacy with which Dalí uses the brush here. This is small brushes. He is a master of watercolor. And it's a hard medium. I mean, he's a master of many things. It's incredible what he does with the watercolor. So here, he's changing this. This is the original stipple engraving, of course, and then he's adding, in some cases, very, very subtle lines. This is actually a signature. And this is the way he modulates color to sort of match what's already there. Just to give you a couple more details. This figure is so beautifully painted and so delicately painted that it just blends in and looks as though it were there all along. And then you realize it's really weird because it's Dalí and couldn't have been there all along. And I'm not even talking, so you can see, just so I go back. So this is his watercolor. The remark is not there, of course, the figural drawing at the bottom. Those were added as a separate step in the process, right? So that would have been etched separately. So there's a second print process that happens, right? And that's not entirely clear, I don't think, exactly what the steps were. But first he produces a watercolor, and then probably the size is shrunk down, right? And the print is made, and then this is a separately printed, the etching, or whatever method it was that was used. And then this one, also beautiful. They're all beautiful. But these start out as beautiful things, and they continue to be beautiful things. But look at the handling of paint here. This is amazing, and the resolution is getting a little low. It's not quite sharp enough to truly convey what he's doing. The subtlety of these washes, right? With watercolor, you have to let the paper shine through. It can't be opaque, and he just masters that so beautifully. Here's some more details. This one, where he's added this head, which is another bud on the printed part, the part that's from the 19th century, and he's added hands, arms, legs. And this one, again, always in the ground. We're grounding this figure, and in this case, the figure is being impaled into the ground by the stem of the fig. Can you see these washes, the subtlety of this watercolor wash? And the delicacy. We're talking about a very fine brush. He's taking his time, but it never looks belabored because he's so good with watercolor. And then this one, I didn't put up the original, I didn't put up the Dalí print with the remark. I just picked the details. This is mastery of watercolor, where you can bleed these two colors into each other, and yet they don't lose the definition. And he continues to make the figure segmented. So the figure does not become whole. He keeps the segmentation that was there from the original, and he just adds another segment of leg. Oh, I thought I had more, but anyway, that's all I've got for you today. Thank you for going along for the ride.